What happens when the love you put in your food is twisted into something deadly? Can forgiveness ever mend a broken family?
Welcome to Whispered Truth, where touching stories come alive. Let's jump into today's story.
The kitchen was Eleanor's sanctuary, always had been. But today, it felt more like a pressure cooker. The stainless steel counters, usually gleaming under the recessed lights, were cluttered with bowls, spatulas, and half-used bags of flour, each item a testament to the controlled chaos of a pastry chef in her element. Or at least, a former pastry chef. She wasn't running her lauded patisserie anymore. Instead, she was in her suburban kitchen in Oakwood, California, baking a simple birthday cake for her grandson Oliver. Simple, in theory. In practice, it felt like she was navigating a minefield, the explosives planted not by a clumsy hand, but by generations of unspoken resentments. The cake was a vanilla sponge with raspberry filling, Oliver's favorite. She'd painstakingly crafted sugar flowers, their delicate petals a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere that had permeated her home for the past week, ever since the party planning had begun. Her daughter-in-law, Amelia, had been a constant presence, a shadow flitting around the edges of the kitchen, her silent critiques heavier than any spoken word. Amelia always had this look. A pursed lip, an almost imperceptible shake of the head, that said 1,000 things she never actually said. Today, that look was amplified, a full-blown symphony of disapproval. Eleanor felt it prickling her skin as she delicately applied the frosting. "Are you sure about that shade of pink?" Amelia finally asked, her voice tight. She was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, a pose that screamed judgment. Oliver was engrossed in his tablet in the next room, oblivious to the unspoken drama unfolding in the kitchen. Eleanor paused, the spatula poised midair. The shade was a soft, blush pink, the exact shade Oliver had requested. It was also, Eleanor knew, slightly different from the hyper-bright, almost radioactive pink Amelia had envisioned. "It's a classic rose, Oliver loves it," Eleanor said, her tone deliberately even, refusing to give Amelia the satisfaction of a reaction. She'd spent a lifetime perfecting the art of masking her emotions in the heat of the kitchen. It was a skill that was proving useful now, even in retirement. It wasn't just Amelia. It was her mother, Beatrice, who had arrived yesterday, a walking, talking embodiment of old-fashioned home economics. Beatrice had spent the last 24 hours peppering her with unsolicited advice. They make pre-made buttercream now, so convenient. And are you sure the raspberry filling won't be too tart? Her mother was always lurking in the background, a specter of baking perfection, a constant reminder of Eleanor's past glories. The woman had taught Eleanor in high school and never missed an opportunity to remind Eleanor of the time she had messed up a sponge during a practice test. The humiliation still felt as sharp as a broken sugar shard. Eleanor continued frosting, her movements precise and controlled, as if she were defusing a bomb. The cake was the centerpiece, the focus of today's celebration. It also felt like a battleground. All of them were battling for validation, for a sign of love from each other, a need to know that they are doing it right. For Amelia, it was about control. She had a very specific picture of how this party should go. For Beatrice, it was about an insecurity rooted in the past. And for Eleanor, it was about her past, her work, something that had defined her. She loved her family so much, but it was like a constant battle for survival. Her memories fluttered to the past, to her own mother, a woman who had always praised her cooking, a woman who had passed when she was still a teenager. There was a photo of her in the lounge, a smiling image in a dated frame. Eleanor's family never looked at the image. They had their own relationships, never understanding the one that Eleanor had with her mom. Eleanor missed her mother. Every day. She missed the simplicity of it all. She missed someone who loved her cooking for no other reason than that she made it. She carefully placed the sugar flowers on top of the cake, stepping back to admire her work. It was a beautiful creation, even if she did say so herself. The pink was soft, the flowers vibrant, and the overall effect was one of simple elegance. It was the kind of cake that could silence a room, a cake that spoke of care and attention to detail. That was what she had always been good at making people feel something through her food. There was magic in her hands, a talent that had defined her life. "It's certainly pink," Beatrice said, walking into the kitchen, clasping her hands together. It was a backhanded compliment, a subtle dig disguised as polite observation. Eleanor knew that there wasn't enough pink in the world to impress Beatrice. But why? Eleanor had never understood Beatrice's passive-aggressive comments. It was as if she always needed to be better. It was odd. "Oliver wanted it pink," Eleanor replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I think it looks wonderful." She hoped that sounded convincing. She knew, deep down, it wasn't about the cake. It was about something more, about all the unsaid things that had been fermenting between them. It was about the roles they had fallen into, the expectations they had placed on each other. The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of the first guests. A wave of relief washed over Eleanor. Maybe now the tension would dissipate, replaced by the cheerful chaos of a children's party. She just wanted to celebrate her grandson's birthday, something that had become almost impossible with the toxic dynamic that has been created in her family. There were only 3 people who felt like they were at war, yet the ripple effects touched all the others. She walked over to the table and slowly started to put up the plates, the forks, the party hats. It was all very organized, very Eleanor. It was also Amelia's influence. And Beatrice approved. The small talk commenced. The adults made the usual comments about the weather. The kids ran around in chaotic glee. It was a blur, a controlled blur. Amelia was flitting around, trying to control the chaos. Beatrice was drinking tea and giving unwanted commentary. Eleanor was trying to smile, her face starting to feel tired. Finally, it was time for the cake. Oliver's eyes widened as he saw it, the pink frosting and sugar flowers capturing his imagination. Eleanor lit the candles, a small smile creeping onto her face. They all started to sing "Happy Birthday," the familiar tune, a brief reprieve from the tension that was threatening to boil over. Oliver blew out the candles, everyone clapped, and Eleanor carefully cut the first slice. As she handed a piece to Oliver, she caught Amelia's eye. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, a flash of fear that Eleanor couldn't quite decipher. She immediately dismissed it, focusing on Oliver, watching his face as he took a bite. And then his face contorted. His cheeks flushed, his eyes started to water, and his hands flew to his throat. In that moment, the party dissolved, the cheerful music faded into a low hum, and time seemed to stop. Oliver was gasping for air. Amelia was screaming. Panic consumed the room, like a toxic gas. Everything was chaos. Eleanor felt her heart stop. She had no idea what was going on. She had baked this cake with love, and now her grandson was choking.
Wait! Sorry to interrupt you, but please subscribe to our channel Whispered Truth and reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your subscribe and like helps us a lot, and comment your favorite part. Now let's get back to the story.
The world narrowed to the frantic gasping of Oliver, the panicked cries of Amelia. Eleanor's mind, usually a well-oiled machine of precision and timing, short-circuited. It was as if she were watching the scene unfold from behind a pane of glass, the sounds muffled, the actions slow and deliberate. She reacted on instinct, years of ingrained calm and order surfacing to push back against the terror gripping her heart. She dropped the knife, its clatter loud in the sudden silence that followed Amelia's scream, and moved towards Oliver. Amelia was cradling him, her face a mask of white-hot panic. "He can't breathe. He's choking," she shrieked, her voice cracking. Beatrice, for once, was speechless, her usual composure shattered. Eleanor, pushing past the fear that was threatening to consume her, gently took Oliver from Amelia's arms. She turned him over, his small body limp in her hands. Her years as a pastry chef hadn't prepared her for this. Her life was about creating things that made people happy. It was about sweetness and joy, never pain. But she knew what she had to do. She remembered a first aid class she had taken years ago, long before she had grandchildren. With a calm that belied the chaos in her mind, she began the Heimlich maneuver. The room held its breath, all eyes locked on Eleanor's determined face. Each thrust felt like a lifetime. She did the maneuver again and again. Oliver was not responding. And then finally, after what felt like an eternity, a small piece of something dislodged from his throat. He coughed, a ragged, painful sound, but a sound of life. Air rushed back into his lungs. He started to cry. Amelia threw herself on him, sobbing with relief, hugging him tightly. "Oh, my baby, she cried, her voice choked with emotion. Eleanor slumped back against the counter, her legs suddenly weak. She felt a strange sense of detachment, her body still trembling, but her mind starting to race. What had just happened? Why did Oliver choke? It had to be something in the cake. She had been so careful. She always was. Years of experience made her hyper-aware of every single ingredient. She used top-quality products. She had checked everything. She thought. She went over her checklist again in her head, every step of the process. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was different. The room was a mess. Children were crying. The laughter that had filled the house only moments ago, replaced by fear and confusion. Beatrice looked like she was about to pass out. "Call an ambulance," Amelia screamed, clutching Oliver tightly. He was still coughing, but his breathing was improving. Eleanor reached for her phone, her hands shaking. While she was dialing, a small, unfamiliar voice whispered in the back of her mind, a seed of doubt that began to take root. How could she have missed something? Was it possible? Was she losing her touch? She pushed the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their presence a calming force in the chaotic aftermath of the incident. They quickly assessed Oliver, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to the emotional storm swirling around them. They confirmed that he was stable, but recommended a trip to the hospital to be sure. Amelia, still trembling, agreed immediately. She picked Oliver up, holding him tightly as she moved to the front door. She didn't look back. Eleanor watched as her daughter-in-law and grandson climbed into the ambulance, the flashing lights reflecting off the windows of the house. It felt surreal, like a scene from a poorly written movie. A movie where everything she had worked so hard for was crashing down around her. A movie where she was the villain. The house was silent now, the silence thick and suffocating. Beatrice was sitting on the sofa, looking ashen. Eleanor went to stand by her, her own emotions a tangle of confusion and fear. "What happened?" Beatrice asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Eleanor replied, her voice hoarse. She still couldn't piece it together. Her mind refused to accept what was happening. She never made mistakes. "I don't understand." She went over each of the ingredients once more. She picked up the cake, her eyes moving over the remaining portion, searching for an answer, a sign. She picked up a fork and took a piece, slowly putting it into her mouth. The taste was familiar. It was perfect. It was the cake she had designed, the cake she had made. And then her tongue felt it. Something gritty, something unexpected. She spat it into her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a fine powder, almost translucent, but definitely there. She brought it closer to her eyes, her face contorted with shock. She had never used this before. It was a fine white powder that almost looked like sugar, yet it had a strange texture. Her mind raced. She could not be sure what this was. She had no recollection of putting this into the cake. She knew what it was. It was not a baking ingredient. She walked to the pantry and began to move items around, her hands trembling. And then she saw it. A small, almost empty container, tucked behind a bag of flour. It was a container of ground-up almonds. Ground-up almonds that she had never owned. Her heart sank. This was the source of Oliver's reaction, the unexpected ingredient that had almost killed him. She looked at Beatrice, who was watching her intently, a strange expression on her face. Eleanor suddenly felt cold, a chill that ran deeper than the fear she had experienced earlier. It was a feeling of betrayal. Someone had deliberately sabotaged her cake. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted. And she knew who. It could only be Beatrice. She had been watching her all day, her criticism and commentary a smokescreen for her sinister plan. A plan rooted in a deep, festering jealousy that had been brewing for years. The pieces fell into place, the puzzle finally solved. Beatrice had always resented her success, her talent. She had never accepted her. She had finally done something to destroy everything. The anger that surged through Eleanor was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was raw, visceral, and powerful. It was anger that burned. She looked at Beatrice, her eyes flashing with a cold fury. "You did this, didn't you?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with a quiet rage. Beatrice's face crumpled, her composure finally breaking. She started to cry, her hands flying to her face. I didn't mean for it to go that far," she stammered, her voice choked with sobs. I just wanted you to know how it feels to fail." The confession was like a knife to Eleanor's heart. She had thought they had a relationship, albeit a difficult one. But it was a relationship. They were family. And now, after everything she had just experienced, Beatrice's actions were the final straw. Eleanor didn't want to hear any more. She was done. Her life was in chaos, and Beatrice was the architect. She walked out of the kitchen and went to the lounge. She looked at her mother's picture. She felt a sudden sadness, a pain she hadn't expected. She felt lost. She felt alone. The silence in the house was a living thing, pressing down on Eleanor, suffocating her with its weight. The sound of Beatrice's sobs echoed through the empty rooms, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had just unfolded. But Eleanor couldn't feel pity, not yet. All she felt was a cold, hard anger, a desire for retribution that burned in her gut. She stood by her mother's picture, her eyes fixed on the faded image, searching for some sort of solace, some sort of answer to the chaos that had become her life. Her mother, with her warm smile and gentle eyes, seemed a world away from the mess she was in right now. Her mother, the one person who had always believed in her talent, in her abilities. A talent that had just been used to hurt her, to destroy her. A talent that had now been tainted. Eleanor closed her eyes, and a flood of memories washed over her. Memories of her childhood, of her mother's kitchen, a place of warmth and laughter. She remembered the smell of freshly baked bread, the sound of her mother's humming as she kneaded dough, the feel of her mother's hands guiding her as she learned to bake. These memories were a stark contrast to the cold, clinical environment of her current kitchen, a place of fear and pain. She remembered the day she had decided she wanted to be a pastry chef, a day when her mother had baked her a cake for her 10th birthday. She had been in awe of the delicate beauty of the frosting, the perfect balance of flavors, the sheer artistry of it all. It was magic. She wanted to create magic like that. She had been just a young girl who dreamed of making people happy. And now that dream had been twisted and distorted, used as a weapon against her. Her mother had always encouraged her, had always been her biggest supporter. She would be devastated by what had just happened. She opened her eyes, the image of her mother's smile etched in her mind. She could almost hear her saying, "You're stronger than this, Eleanor. You'll get through this." She needed to be. She knew that. She had always been the strong one, the one who held things together, the one who could handle anything. But this felt different. This was a betrayal by a member of her family. This was deeply personal. This was about someone wanting to inflict pain. She walked back into the kitchen, the scene of the crime, the heart of her broken world. She went to the counter, carefully picking up the cake. It felt heavy in her hands. She looked at it, her eyes moving over the sugar flowers, the pink frosting, the layers of sponge and filling. It was still beautiful, even after all the chaos, even after all the pain. It was a symbol of her life, of her passions, of her identity. And someone had tried to destroy it. She went to the rubbish bin, her hands shaking. She was about to throw it away, to get rid of this awful creation, when she stopped. It was her work. It was her blood, sweat, and tears. She wouldn't give that up. She placed it back on the counter. She needed to know the truth. She needed to understand why. She picked up the container of ground-up almonds, her fingers tracing the label. It was a brand she had never used before. She opened it, the smell of almonds filling her nostrils. It was the smell of betrayal. It was the smell of pure malice. She wanted to hurt Beatrice, to inflict the same pain that had been inflicted on her. She wanted justice. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm that was raging within her. She thought of Oliver, his small face contorted with pain, his eyes filled with fear. The thought of her grandson was the only thing grounding her. He was safe now. She needed to focus. She needed to figure out her next move. She was not going to let this go. She would make Beatrice pay. She would make sure she would never hurt her family again. She walked back to the lounge, Beatrice still sitting on the sofa, her face buried in her hands. "I want to know why," Eleanor said, her voice calm but firm. "Why did you do this, Beatrice?" Beatrice didn't answer, her sobs continuing, her body shaking. Eleanor sat down opposite her, her eyes unwavering. "You need to tell me, Beatrice. You owe me that much." Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her face a mask of guilt and shame. "I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I was just so jealous. You always had everything. You were always so talented, so successful. Everyone always praised you," she went on, her voice rising. "You were never wrong. You always got things right. It was always you. And what does that have to do with poisoning my grandson?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp, her patience wearing thin. "I didn't mean to poison him," Beatrice said, her eyes widening with panic. "I just wanted to ruin your cake. I just wanted to see you fail. For once, you always made me feel so inadequate, especially after the humiliation of high school. I never forgot it. Never." The tears streamed down her face. Her words were pathetic. The story she was painting for herself made her the victim. Eleanor felt a deep sense of disgust. She couldn't believe this. The pettiness. The pure evil. "So, that's what this is about, high school?" Eleanor asked. She could hardly believe the words coming out of her own mouth. "I've always hated you for being so talented. Your cooking is flawless. People love it. I wanted a small piece of that glory. I wanted to feel important. I thought that if you failed, I would finally feel as though I had succeeded at something." Beatrice's words were like a slap in the face, a painful reminder of the deep-seated insecurities that had driven her actions. She had been so consumed by her own feelings of inadequacy that she had deliberately tried to harm her family. She had let her feelings consume her, Eleanor felt her anger return, a wave of pure fury washing over her. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "You're pathetic, Beatrice," she said, her voice cold, her eyes hard. "You're a sad, pathetic woman who tried to kill my grandson because you're jealous. I can't believe I even wasted my time trying to understand." Eleanor turned away, no longer able to look at her, the sight of her just filled with so much rage. She walked out of the lounge, leaving Beatrice alone with her shame and her guilt. This was not over. Not by a long shot. Eleanor had a plan, and it would be far from sweet. She was not the woman she used to be. She had experienced a betrayal she never thought possible. A family member was capable of pure evil. She was a different person now. Eleanor retreated to her kitchen, her sanctuary now a space of cold calculation. The stainless steel surfaces no longer reflected the warm glow of her passion, but the hard glint of her determination. She needed to think, to plan, to channel the rage that was coursing through her veins into something constructive, something that would deliver a form of justice. She could go to the police, but that wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't mend the broken trust, it wouldn't erase the image of Oliver's panicked face, and it certainly wouldn't quell the fire that burned within her. She needed something more personal, something that would make Beatrice understand the depth of her betrayal, the magnitude of her actions. She wouldn't use physical violence. That was not her way. She would use her mind, her skills, her expertise to turn Beatrice's own methods against her. She was going to use food. She started by cleaning the kitchen, meticulously scrubbing every surface, washing every dish, as if trying to erase the stain of Beatrice's actions. Each movement was deliberate, each action a step towards reclaiming her space, her identity. As she worked, her mind started to formulate a plan, a recipe for revenge, if you will. It was not going to be quick. It would be slow, deliberate, and utterly devastating. She had spent years perfecting the art of baking, of creating flavors that evoked emotions, that brought joy, that made people feel special. Now she would use her skills to create a different kind of experience, an experience that would leave a bitter taste in Beatrice's mouth, a reminder of the pain she had inflicted. She started by pulling out her old recipe books, the ones she had used when she owned her patisserie. She hadn't looked at them in years, but they were like old friends, each page filled with memories, with her passion. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the recipes, her mind racing. She was looking for something specific, something that would be both subtle and effective, something that would exploit Beatrice's insecurities and weaknesses. She found it, hidden amongst the old recipes, a recipe for a dessert she had created years ago, a dessert that was deceptively simple, yet incredibly complex in flavor. It was a type of cake with a very particular icing, a type of icing that would have to be made from scratch. She remembered the long hours she had spent perfecting the recipe, the countless trials and errors, the sheer dedication it had taken. She would use that same dedication now, but with a different purpose. It would be her masterpiece. She had always taken pride in her work, in creating masterpieces. This would be her final one. She carefully wrote down the ingredients, her hand moving with a newfound purpose, her eyes focused on the task at hand. This would not be about kindness or love or compassion. This would be about revenge. She left the kitchen and went upstairs, taking a shower, trying to wash away the grime, trying to start afresh. She still felt heavy, as if an invisible weight was pressing on her chest. She felt the tears welling up, and this time, she allowed them to fall. She had been through so much, had faced so many challenges, but nothing had ever hurt this much. This was a deep, personal pain that went beyond anything she had ever experienced. She closed her eyes, imagining Oliver's face, his smile, his laughter. She had to be strong. She had to do this for him. She was not going to let Beatrice get away with this. She was not going to allow her family to be hurt by this toxic woman ever again. She got dressed, her clothes feeling heavier than usual. She went downstairs, where Beatrice was still sitting on the sofa, her face buried in her hands. Eleanor didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. The next few days were a blur. Eleanor was busy, focusing on her plan, her mind constantly working, her hands constantly moving. She visited the grocery store, meticulously selecting the ingredients she needed, choosing only the best quality, the best brands. She then moved to the kitchen, her laboratory. She spent hours perfecting the recipe, each step done with precision and care. It was like a meditation, a way of processing her anger, a way of regaining control. She had no idea what to expect. She never thought her life would go down this path. She was not an evil person. She was a good one. And she had been deeply hurt. She was unsure of what the future held, but she knew what she needed to do now. She had always had a sense of duty to her family, to her craft, to herself. And that sense of duty had now found a new target. She baked the cake, the aroma filling the kitchen, a familiar scent that used to bring her joy, but now just reminded her of her stolen dream. The scent was familiar, yet it felt different. It felt tainted. She baked the cake with a cold detachment. She knew that what she was doing was wrong, but she didn't care. She felt justified. She was protecting her family. She was making sure no one would hurt them again. She carefully applied the icing, her hand moving with a steady precision, her eyes fixed on the task at hand. It was her masterpiece, and now it would become a weapon. She finished decorating it. The result was a beautiful creation, a work of art that hid a dark secret. She made sure Beatrice saw it. She placed it carefully on the kitchen counter so that it was in her direct line of sight. She was baiting her. She wanted her to see it. She wanted her to know what was coming. She wanted to see the fear in her eyes. She was planning on serving this cake at a small family dinner that she had arranged. She wanted everyone to be there. She was going to tell her story. She was going to expose Beatrice. She was going to make sure that this would never happen again. She was in control. Finally, she had always been the victim. This time, she was the victor. The family dinner was an exercise in forced normalcy, the tension palpable beneath the veneer of polite conversation. Eleanor had orchestrated the entire event, choosing the menu, setting the table, making sure that everyone was in their assigned seats. Amelia and Oliver had returned from the hospital, Oliver thankfully recovering, albeit still shaken by the experience. Amelia, her face drawn and tired, watched Eleanor with a mixture of fear and suspicion. The incident had amplified her anxieties, leaving her more guarded than ever. Her emotions were a constant roller coaster, moving from anger to sadness to concern for her child. She was exhausted. Oliver, though outwardly cheerful, clung to Amelia's side, his eyes occasionally darting around the room, a flicker of unease in their depths. Beatrice was strangely quiet, her usual commentary replaced by a nervous fidgeting, her gaze constantly shifting towards the cake on the counter. She knew what was coming. The tension in the room was a physical thing. The silence felt like a ticking bomb, ready to explode. The meal was served, the food a testament to Eleanor's skills, but it was also a distraction, a way to avoid talking about the elephant in the room. She had created an array of dishes, each one carefully chosen to be appealing, yet nothing would be able to match the dessert. Eleanor had made sure that the cake was the main event, the piece de resistance, a creation that was beautiful on the outside, but hiding a dark secret. The conversation was stilted, the usual family banter replaced by hesitant words and nervous laughter. Everyone was walking on eggshells, careful not to say anything that might trigger another outburst. Eleanor observed them all, her eyes moving from Amelia to Oliver to Beatrice. Each of them was playing a role in her carefully crafted plan. Each of them was a pawn in her chess game. Finally, the meal was over. The time had come. Eleanor stood up, her hands resting on the table, her eyes sweeping across the faces of her family. Her voice was calm, but firm. "I have something I need to say," she began, her words hanging in the air. All eyes were on her, the silence in the room intensifying. A few days ago, during Oliver's birthday party, he had a severe allergic reaction after eating the cake. It was not a coincidence. Amelia gasped, her eyes widening with horror. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It wasn't my fault," Eleanor continued, her gaze fixed on Beatrice. "It wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately put ground-up almonds in the cake. Someone who knew that Oliver was allergic." Beatrice flinched, her body trembling. She looked down, refusing to meet Eleanor's gaze. "And that someone was Beatrice," Eleanor finished, her voice flat, her eyes never leaving Beatrice's face. The room erupted in chaos. Amelia started crying, Oliver looked confused, and Beatrice didn't move. "How could you?" Amelia yelled, her voice shaking with rage. "How could you do that to my son?" She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to inflict pain. The same pain that she was currently experiencing. Eleanor put up a hand. "There is more," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You all need to hear this. Why?" Beatrice suddenly asked, her voice breaking. She knew this was not going to be good. She needed to stop this. Eleanor calmly told the whole story, from the beginning to the end, each word a dagger aimed directly at Beatrice. She told them everything: Beatrice's deep jealousy, her old resentments, her need for revenge. She didn't miss a single detail. She held nothing back. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were on Beatrice, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. "But why?" Amelia asked, finally finding her voice. Her face contorted. "Why would you do something like that?" She was struggling to understand. She could not accept the level of cruelty that Beatrice was capable of. "Because I was jealous," Beatrice whispered, her voice barely audible. "I hated her. She had always been better than me. It was not fair. I was nothing." She started to cry harder. Her whole world was breaking down. Finally, she had been exposed. Her inner insecurities were being seen by her family. The people she had craved attention from were now disgusted by her. This was her worst nightmare. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Beatrice. "You know what the worst part of this is?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. "I was so upset, so hurt, and yet I still baked you a cake." She turned to the side to reveal the cake, the same cake that Beatrice had been staring at all night. She grabbed a knife and cut a slice. "I made it especially for you, with all my love and all my hate all mixed in." Beatrice looked up at the cake, a look of terror on her face. Eleanor put the slice onto a plate and placed it in front of Beatrice. "Go on," she said, her voice hard. "Eat it." Beatrice shook her head, her body trembling. "No," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I can't." Eleanor leaned forward, her face inches from Beatrice's. "You wanted to see me fail, didn't you? Well, I'm not going to. So eat the cake. It's delicious." She was testing her. She knew that she would not eat it, that the fear of what Eleanor may have done was more powerful than her desire for chaos. Beatrice looked at the cake, her eyes darting back and forth, not knowing what to do. And then it finally happened. She broke down. She started crying uncontrollably, her body shaking as she tried to contain the sobs. "I can't do," she cried. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She finally felt remorse. Her plan had backfired. She had lost. She had hurt everyone she loved. Her family. Eleanor stepped back, her face unreadable. She didn't feel any satisfaction. She felt tired. She felt used. She picked up the cake, her hands moving slowly. She took it to the bin and dumped it. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had won. She had exposed Beatrice for the evil woman she was. She turned back to the table, watching the chaos around her. Amelia was holding Oliver, her eyes filled with rage, her body shaking. She knew she had to end this. She knew that she had to try. For her family. For herself. "This has to stop," she said, her voice soft. "I'm so tired. This is enough. We need to forgive. We need to move on." She knew that it was not going to be easy, but she also knew that it was the only way. She had learned a lot during these past few days. She had seen the dark side of her family, but she also knew that they loved each other, even though they had a strange way of showing it. The aftermath was quiet. The families separated to their own places. The conversation still stealthy. But Eleanor felt a calm. Her revenge had been served. The anger had dissipated. What remained was a sense of peace, a feeling that everything was finally going to be okay. The cake, the symbol of her passion, her identity, was gone. But her family was still there. And that was all that mattered. The ending was not neat, it was complicated. It was real. She had taught everyone a lesson, even herself. The recipe for revenge was not sweet, but it was effective. And now it was time to move on.
Hey, want to listen to another best story? Then click the floating video and subscribe for more.